and welcome to Making Known the Unknown, Series 2, Ignorance, the Mother of Devotion. I'm your host, Tina Tarryk, and with me tonight are my guests, Sidney Schwartz, middle school teacher and Bible researcher of some 25 plus years. Welcome, Sidney.
Hi, Tina.
And Reverend Hewitt, pastor and founder of Gifts of the Spirit Church and medium. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you.
Okay, and welcome to all our viewers out there. Tonight's show is going to blow your minds out. The title of the show tonight is Religious Rituals. And as you could probably imagine, underneath that title, we have many, many types of rituals that we wish to discuss and share with you, not only with respect to biblical connections or day-to-day connections in the modern world, but also the research behind those connections that Sidney Schwartz and Reverend Hewitt have put together to make the show this evening. But before we do get started with that, there is in addition to our set tonight, I don't know if any of you would have noticed this, that in the past we have had this enlarged version of a precipitated art card, and as well as this one. But we have another new piece of art this evening that I'm sure some of you are curious about. And what I wanted to do was have Reverend Hewitt explain to you just a little bit about how this beautiful piece of art came to be. Carl.
1982, when I was working in Charleston, South Carolina, the energy of the spirit entities brought this to me in order for me to explain what would be happening to me in the future, that I would be the guiding star of his existence in the near future. And every word of that has come true to the letter. So it was after this message that this happened and this happened. Every word of it has come true. And this is the first time that this has been taken out of the chapel. They told me last night that this has to be put on the set as of today. So that's why it's here.
Okay.
Be more on this in coming shows.
Thank you. That's what I was going to remind our viewers, is that there's actually a very, very interesting and detailed and unusual story behind the creation of this piece of art. So tune in, and we will be discussing that as promised.
Yes.
Okay. As I mentioned, the topic for tonight's show is religious rituals. And what we're talking about specifically are mindless things that priests, ministers, rabbis, people of the clergy in general have really instructed people to do over thousands and thousands of years. And we're going to dive into a few of those religious rituals and see if they make sense or not. And I guess one of the foundations that we need to start with, and we'll begin with you, Carl, is just in general what the word psychic or psyche comes from. And we really need to clarify that first before we go through this show.
Well, it's a word that I don't like. I hate that word simply because it's so misunderstood. To me, it's tainted, and yet we have a big dictionary here on the table in front of us, and so very few people use it. But when you look in the dictionary, the word psychic means soul and mind. Everybody has mind, everybody has a soul, but nobody looks it up. And the word psychic means soul and mind. Everyone has a mind, everyone has a soul, and everyone is psychic to some degree. Everyone. It is so simple. And yet, most people, because of what the clergy has said to them down through the ages, that it's the work of the devil. And there is no such thing as the devil. That was all created years ago. It was created by the clergy, by the way, and to me, that was ignorance back those days. Today, it's recycled ignorance, and that's my expression for that.
Okay. With that, what we would like to do is continue on with Sidney Schwartz. Now, Sidney, you have some research and some Bible quotes to start with that sort of begin our quest of religious rituals.
Well, back in biblical and ancient times, basically there were no police departments, and the people who ruled all of society were the priests. They were the ones. They were even the people. The priests were the ones that crowned the king. So it wasn't the king who was in charge. It was the priests who were in charge. And the priests came up with all these different laws and rules and rituals to keep the people in line to do exactly what they wanted them to do. And it's interesting because a lot of many rituals that exist, there's a psychic meaning behind them. And sometimes all you have to do is scratch the surface a little bit and they start bleeding psychic phenomena once you understand psychic science. But today what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the things that the priests taught to the people that they wanted them to follow. And most of the time, the priests would say that these rules and regulations came from God, or they were the laws of Moses, and then Moses decided on these laws, and that people should follow them because God told Moses, and Moses told the people through the gift of mediumship, and so they should follow it. And society was very different back then. The first one that I came across is Leviticus chapter 20, verse 9, and it says, "For everyone that curses his father or mother shall be surely put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother, his blood shall be upon him." And that's the King James Version. So in other words, in those days, they demanded the children to respect their parents so much that if they said something bad about them or cursed them, they would be killed. Imagine what would happen today if that happened. I mean, we'd have, there's so little respect from so many young people towards our older people that it's pretty amazing.
I went back in research and found out at one time there was 1,000 slaves in the Vatican, 1,000, and there was one particular slave there. He was very outgoing, and I pictured him to be tall, and he was one who thought for himself. And he met the Pope in the corridor, and he said to the Pope, "Can I have a few words with you?" And I think that the Pope was kind of taken back because he had the nerve to speak to him, you see. And the Pope wanted to know what he had to say. And he said, "Is it really right for you to own us, body, mind, and spirit?" And he says, "It is God's word that we can own you." And he said, "It's written in the book." And at that time, upstairs, they were rewriting the Bible. And so the Pope says, "I don't have time to talk with you now," but he says, "I will let you know in a couple of days where it is in the book." So he goes upstairs, the Pope did, where one of the scribes was rewriting, I believe it was Leviticus. Is that true?
Yeah, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 44 through 46.
Yes, and he went up there where the scribe was writing the Bible, and he said, "You know what, one of the slaves just asked me this question." And so the scribe says, "Oh, I'll take care of that." And he wrote it right there he inserted it in the Bible. And then the next day or two, he gave that writing to the Pope, and the Pope got a hold of that slave, and he told it to him, because the slaves couldn't read. And he says, "Here it is, right here, it's God's word." And so the poor slave went about his business, thinking it was God's word, and that was it. And all the way down through the ages, it was handed down that it was God's word, that they could have slaves. And this is what caused slavery. And with all these slaves that were sold in this country, by religions, mind you. And I came from this part of the country where that was a big business.
So you mean to tell me the foundations for slavery actually came through
religion?
The Pope and religions?
Yes, it was Pope Gregory I.
Really?
That's what Spirit had said. And in fact, during right before the Civil War in this country in the 1850s or 1860s, when the abolitionist movement was very strong, the Christians at that point were, especially the Southern Christians, they were very upset with the abolitionists, and they said the abolitionists was doing the work of the devil because they were contradicting what was in the Bible. Because it said in the Bible that you can own slaves, and therefore, since the abolitionists didn't want to have slaves, they said that was devil work.
You have the quote that's in the Bible. Could
Yes.
you read that for us, please.
As for your male and female slaves whom you shall have, you may buy male and female slaves from the nations that are around you. You may bequeath them to your sons after you, and to inherit as possessions forever. And that's from the Revised Standard Version.
So it also gave people permission to go into other countries, like they were going shopping,
Well,
but for people.
according to this, they weren't supposed to make other Hebrews slaves, so all the slaves had to come from a different country.
Oh, I see. Okay. Of course, not their own.
Not their own.
Someone else.
Right.
Uh-huh. Very interesting and very sad.
Yes.
Very sad. I was curious as to not only the slavery issue, but were there any other rituals in time, such as one that's very popular that you hear all the time, that the Jewish people cannot eat pork
Right.
on certain holidays or at certain times of the year.
Well, see, the Jewish people follow the Old Testament and the rules in there, and the Orthodox especially. They follow it to the letter. And in Deuteronomy 14:8, it reads, "Pigs may not be eaten because although they have cloven hooves, they do not chew the cud." A couple of verses before that, it says you can't eat any animal that doesn't chew the cud and have a cloven hoof. So a pig does have a cloven hoof, but it doesn't have a cud to chew. You may not even touch the dead bodies of such animals. So that, Tina, this brings up an interesting point, is that you think about these, especially in the fall, you think about football, and you go, Notre Dame University is out there playing football. And if they were really good Christians and were following what was in the Bible, they couldn't even touch the football because it's made out of a pigskin.
Right.
So
Right.
And having bacon and eggs for breakfast is also should be a very un-Christian thing to do, because the Christians accept the Old Testament, so yet they're not following the rules.
Have you found any other examples of foods that can or cannot be eaten, but without any foundation as to the reason?
Sure. In that same section in Deuteronomy 14:9, it talks about that as far as fish goes, only sea animals with fins and scales may be eaten. All other kinds are ceremonially defiled, so they're considered unclean. So that means you're not allowed to have shrimp or lobster or scallops or clams or any of those crabs, any of those shellfish is not considered. Jewish people don't eat those, and they're forbidden. But yet again, how many seafood restaurants are serving them, and everybody seems very happy about it.
So once again, it's something that people are told to do because it's in the Bible, it's law, and they don't do it.
Right.
But the big question is why?
Well, you could say that many Christians pick and choose what they will accept from the Old Testament. Some people call them cafeteria Christians, where they'll take this law and obey it, and then the next law, two verses away, they'll disobey that one, and they'll follow one. The reason why that they've gotten away with it, I should say, is because in the year 49 A.D. The Christians came together and they had a council, and it was one of the first councils of the church. And because they were trying to get the pagans to convert to Christianity, they wanted to make it as appealing as they could. And these if you think about the Mediterranean cultures, such as like Greece and Turkey, and they were really based, they had a lot of seafood there. They were used to eating all the shellfish and so forth. So in order to make Christianity more enticing, they passed a law at this council saying that they no longer had to follow Mosaic law, which is some of these laws that we're talking about. So it wasn't that a voice from on high came down and said, forget this, you don't have to do it anymore. And it wasn't that this came from God. It was just for convenience. The church says, well, let's forget this part, we'll get more converts. So this is the reason that they got rid of a lot of these things. And that's why Christians can pick and choose.
I suppose that would make sense, because if you lived in an area where a lot of pigs were the only source of protein, and you told people they couldn't eat pork, well, then you're starving them to death. Likewise, that you mentioned with the Mediterranean community and seafood. You know what that makes me think of? It makes me think of these old laws in general that are on the books throughout quite a bit of the United States that are antiquated, outdated, and don't apply.
Right.
And you know, those laws go something like, if you do this, this, and this, you have to walk down Main Street with a chicken on your head painted blue, and so on and so on the first full moon of the month or something. And it just, to me, would seem that if people would actually go through with this, there has to be something to be said about this fear of either authority or authority in God that's placed in the Bible, or the fear that's placed in people as a result of not obeying the Bible. It just really seems sort of trivial to me.
Yeah, that's very true. But you know, again, a lot of things that, you know, some of the things that they did might have served the purpose. For example, this one other law that was in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18 to 21, and it says, if a man has a stubborn, rebellious son who will not obey his father and mother. So in other words, the son's not behaving, as happens so often today. Even though they punish him, then his father and mother should take him before the elders of the city and declare, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious and won't obey. He's a worthless drunkard, and the men in the city shall stone him to death. So in order to keep law and order, if you didn't obey your parents, I mean, you know, it was a capital offense.
I think that's a little severe. I mean, to stone someone to death and then also being accused of being a drunkard, which may or may not have anything to do with their behavior problems. That is a little severe.
Yes.
Okay.
It is rather severe, but you know, in some ways, you know, it's we've swung the total opposite direction. I feel, you know, with the way that sometimes children talk to their parents and their teachers and so forth.
Now, one of the big issues that always comes up when you hear people talk about the Ten Commandments is the issue of adultery, and whether that was something that was laid down by Moses and put in the Bible, and if the versions that are in the Bible are really what was intended, or they have been changed, or they've been altered to make the point with respect to adultery in that area. Do you have any information on that?
Well, you know, it's very difficult to know what's been changed in the Bible, as Reverend Hewitt was talking about with Pope Gregory and the insertion of slavery. The only records that I came up with about how the Bible has been changed is dealing with Saint Jerome, and in around 390 A.D. to early 400s, he was working on the Vulgate Bible, and what he was doing was there was many different versions of the Bible around in Latin, and they contradicted each other. They weren't all saying the same thing. So Jerome took it upon, or he didn't take it upon himself. The Pope asked him to do a translation. So he went and he kind of homogenized everything, and he kind of edited in his own viewpoints and things. One of the things that he did was he talked about Moses, and there's a quote in the Bible where it talks about Moses coming down the mountain, and because he had spoken with God so much, his auric field had expanded so much that when your top chakra is open, there's a funnel of light that comes out, and that funnel of light on the outermost portion is a little bit darker than the inside. And so people who were a little bit clairvoyant, or some people could see this light, kind of looked like there were beams coming from his head. Mm. So in the Bible, it talks about Moses having beams being beamed or shining, his face shone. But in the Vulgate Bible, it says he has horns. And if you go into medieval Bibles, it shows Moses with horns on his head, just like the devil. Michelangelo's statue of Moses, Moses has horns on his head just like the devil. And that's because of this mistranslation that Jerome put into the Bible. But when he presented his finished product to all the bishops and cardinals at the Vatican, they nearly had a riot because he had changed so much that they weren't happy with the translation at all. So, but getting back to adultery, what's written in the Old Testament, as far as we know, is Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. It says, and a man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even that he committed adultery with his own neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress should surely be put to death. So that also was a capital offense. But you know, it's kind of interesting that although on some things, some fundamentalist Christians come about and they're very vocal about the sins of certain things, when President Clinton had his mishap, and it was very much in the news dealing with adultery, nobody was yelling from the pulpits that he should be stoned to death or killed
Right.
because of his adulterous affair. But yet they'll say that about other groups of people.
Well, we have the state of Utah, right? That's a good portion of that was founded by the Mormons, the Church of Latter-day Saints.
Right.
Hopefully, I'm not
Yes,
quoting that.
Joseph Smith was the founder of that. He had a vision. We'll be
Right.
talking a little bit about that a little bit later.
But that whole notion, as far as that state goes, is okay. Yet in other Bibles, it's not okay with respect to polygamy.
Well, in the Bible, a man's allowed to have two wives, because Deuteronomy 21:15 says if a man has two wives, and it goes on to talk about something else. And that didn't really go away until Christianity didn't like the idea. And they were the ones that kind of put the stop to polygamy as far as for Christianity. And as far what I know from Judaism, sometime in the Middle Ages, they decided to just be monogamous, to fit more into their surroundings, the Christian surroundings, because they were. But that's the history of that.
So we can see just with that small example that there's a separation with respect to different religions
Yes.
on that basis alone.
Right.
And that's a pretty significant
Well, the Islamic religion
difference.
allows the men to have more than one wife still, because they never reformed it.
That's right.
They're
That's
allowed
right.
to have up to 4.
Now, you've also brought with you a few other quotes from the Bible that refer to religious rituals. And if you will, I'd like you to go through those.
Sure. One of them is Leviticus 19:27, and it says, "You must not trim the hair on your temples or clip the edges of your beard, as the heathens do." Apparently, some of the other religions, they shave their bodies totally, and so the Jewish people didn't want anything to do with that, so they stopped that. Something I found kind of interesting, and I'm using the Living Bible here, and it says it quite graphically. It occurs in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 12 through 13. And it says, "The toilet area shall be outside the camp. Every man must have a spade as part of his equipment, and after every bowel movement he must dig a hole with the spade and cover the excrement." We no longer do that, thank God we don't have to do that anymore. But that's where the way things were. The point of some of this that we're kind of talking about is that a lot of the things that are in the Bible have become antiquated, such as the subject matter I just spoke about. And yet, some people look at the Bible very literally, and they think that every word's true and every word should be followed, but you don't see them going around with a shovel anymore,
No.
So they choose what they want to accept, and they don't choose what they don't want to accept.
But not to make a joke out of this, but could it be that the translator here does not have running water in their home?
Could be.
Could very well be, absolutely. Yes. Central plumbing may not have always been the
Right.
case
Right.
in those times. That's true.
So,
That's true.
and if people who are watching this are saying, well, you're talking all about Moses, what he had to say. And Jesus said we didn't have to do this. He never said that. Because he specifically said that he did not come to change the laws of the prophets, and I believe it's the 5th chapter of Matthew. And he did not come to establish a religion. It was Christianity who changed it back in the years of 49, as I mentioned before. But Jesus also had something interesting another interesting quote that, again, not too many Christians follow. And then again, the person that they look at as their Savior said this quote, and it's coming from Matthew chapter 5, verse 30. "And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not thy whole body be cast into hell." And he also said the next verse, or the verse before that, talks about the same thing, except it deals with an eye. And, you know, you never notice too many devout Christians walking around with an eye patch because they tore their eye out because they looked at something they shouldn't have. You know, Jimmy Swaggart had a little problem back several years ago where he had a adulterous affair that he got caught with, and Mr. Baker had the same problem, and yet they still have two eyes and they still have two arms, so they're not following what's in the Bible either, but they'll get on their pulpits and talk about other little lines in the Bible very strongly.
And none of them were killed for their adulterous affairs.
No.
That's interesting.
No, that's true.
The research that I did, there are 3 years ago, there were 12,000 religions on the planet in that time. 12,000. And the people who gave me the information, and they said that the religions on the planet are the same as what we would know as franchises, McDonald's, Burger King, and that type of thing all over the planet today. I got to thinking about that one day. I was on a trip, you know, on my working trip, and I got to thinking about that. And by God, that is true. They're just like franchises all over the place. So many people don't think of those things, you know what I mean?
And the prophets go to the headquarters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now with 12,000 religions on the planet,
Yeah.
and that was as of 3 years ago,
Yeah.
it would seem that every time somebody does or doesn't want to include one thing or another from a different version of the Bible, and Sidney, you've researched some 250?
Yes, over
or
250
more
Bibles.
versions?
Yes.
What's the point of following all of these rituals? What do people get out of this? What's the benefit of any of this?
Well, some of the people think that they're following God's wishes by doing this. I come from a Jewish background. My grandmother was Orthodox. She kept a kosher home. She kept separate dishes, you know, for meat and dairy, because in the Bible it says you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, and that was a Canaanite practice. So that this whole process of keeping kosher and not eating shellfish and killing the animals a certain way and salting the meat, and because you're not supposed to have any blood in it, and on and on and on, she felt she was doing what God wanted her to do. And so that made her feel good. So, you know, because she was, again, taking things very, very, very literally from what's written in the Bible.
I guess overall there's still a need for people to feel a part of a group, be accepted by a group, and sometimes the cost means perhaps following blindly, regardless of what the outcome might be, or if the outcome is in their best interest or not.
Many of these rituals, people do them without thinking about it, without questioning it, because a lot of the religions you're told not to question. I remember when my grandmother died, she had suffered a stroke, and for about 10 weeks before her death, she couldn't speak or anything. And so when she finally passed over to the other side, my mother wanted to follow all the Jewish traditions and stuff, so we sat Shiva there, and all the people from my grandmother's synagogue came. So well, here are all these Orthodox women, you know. And so my mother said to them, she said, "Why did my mother have to have such a long, belabored death and such a terrible way to die?" And the woman looked right at her and said, "We're not to question. You're not to question God. You're not to question God's will. You're not supposed to question." So it's like programmed into their soul that you just don't question. You never ask why.
Now, just to remind our viewers that we are live. We're live every Friday night. 889-1728. If you have any questions about the topic tonight, which is religious rituals, questions or comments, we welcome them. And what I'd like to do next is go to Reverend Hewitt here, who is going to lead us down the path of a religious ritual that to this date has probably done much, much more damage than good to many, many people. And it started with a particular reading that Carl had. And if you'd like to start with that, Carl, I'd appreciate that.
Well, there was a young man that came to me. I believe that's what you're referring to.
Yes, yes.
There was a young man that came to me a few years back, and he was very nervous. I could even tell by his voice that he was very nervous. And he came to me, and we went into the reading room, and the voice of the entity that works with me said for me to tell him to take the gun out of his pocket and put it on the desk first before we would even talk with him. So I said, I will be glad to help you all I can, providing you do one favor. He says, I will do anything for you, Mr. Hewitt, if you will help me. I says, all right, take the gun that you've got under your coat and put it on the desk. He says, how do you know I've got a gun under my coat? I said, don't ask that question. Please put your gun on the desk. And I was nervous for a split second there because I don't like guns. And he took this pistol out and put it on the desk, and I put it in the drawer of the desk, and I said, you'll get the gun back when the time comes, but for the time being, you're very foolish to think of doing with the gun what you were going to do. And I said, it's going to take longer than an ordinary reading to help you. And I said, Spirit is telling me here that we need a different type of reading here. And so he said, what do you mean? What do you call a reading anyway? Because he said, I don't know what it is you do. But he said, my aunt, my mother's youngest sister, suggested I come to you because you have the ability to see or do something here, communicate with the dead or something. He says, I don't know what it is you do, but my aunt told me that you could help me. And I got on the phone and I called Sidney in New Jersey. And I said, this is very strange, Sidney, but there's a young man here that needs a reading. And I said, the Spirit Control wants you to be here at the same time I read for him, because there's something that you need to know that is related to what he needs to know. I said, this is very unusual. I said, can you be up here, was it on a Saturday?
It was on a Saturday morning, yes.
On Saturday morning, and so we arranged it, and I told the young man, I said, I want you to come back on Saturday at 10 o'clock. And he says, I'll be here. So it turned out that I had to go into trance that day, and this entity came through and used my body. Well, going into trance is like going to sleep. And I don't know what goes on. It all goes on tape, and then I have to listen to the tape to know what happens.
Well, I could describe what happened.
Yeah, please do.
Basically, what happened was that Awan came through. It was the angel without a name, the one that we've written the book about.
Yeah, that book there.
And he explained to Rick the origins of homosexuality, because Rick was having a very difficult time. He had feelings that he was attracted to other men, but yet he was very Catholic. And of course, in the Bible, it says that a man should not lie with a man. In Leviticus, it's one of the verses that they scream from the pulpit left and right, even though they ignore all the other ones we talked about. And so he couldn't reconcile his religious feelings and his personal feelings. So Awan went back and he explained that how homosexuality began, the actual origins of it. And I think this is information that you're not going to find anywhere else. And he told us of a story of a religious ritual that happened in Turkey back in the Hittite kingdom about 1300, 1500 years BC. And I started doing research to see if I could corroborate any of this, and I couldn't find anything. And finally, Reverend Hewitt and I, about 2 years ago, went to Turkey to see if we could find evidence to prove what Awan had said, and we did. And we have a clip of that particular site where we found the evidence, and it'll also explain exactly the origins of homosexuality. What actually happened when we went to this site, Carl started hearing Awan again, and he actually went back into time. And it was actually seeing firsthand exactly what happened at this particular site, and was describing it as I was filming it. And that's how this clip was created. So we edited it down. So
if we could have that clip for our viewers, please, of the trip to Turkey.
This is not an ordinary place. This was a place that the priest had built many, many, many years ago. We can't seem to find any dates dealing with this. This is when they had decided that women did not have a soul, only a man had a soul, and that God created the woman's body for the pleasures of the men, and in order for the men to use this little girl from 4 years old onward, her vagina had to be stretched. And so a ceremony was created which was called blood and water. And this was where it was done. This was one of many places it was done in this country. And the little girl was brought here, and it was a law that any woman who had a child and she came 4 years old, she had to be brought here. It was here that the three priests, a higher priest and these two others, would take the child and stretch its vagina with a marble phallus and then have sex with it. The child would bleed profusely, and the water would be just bloody. And then these two priests would penetrate this child, and that was the final part of the baptizing. From then on, this child could be used by an army, and the parents could not do anything about it because it was a law that the child was put on the world, the girl was put on the world for the pleasures of the males, and it didn't matter how old the person, old or young the person was, they could still use this little girl. And she was used up until the time she came into her first season of blood, maybe 11, 12 years old. She was cast into the street as being unclean, unwanted. Most of them died of starvation before they were 20, only to be pulled back into or sucked back into a reincarnation, another body, and be treated the same way, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. Then there came a desire within the soul of this female to be able to come back in a male body and never be treated this way. So, eventually, through what we term today as evolution, the soul came back in a male body, and that particular male became attracted to other men because the soul in the body was female. And when it came back several times, we do not know how many times, but when it came back several times in the male body, this female soul from the beginning became masculinized. And then when it decided, after a lot of the ignorance passed, when it decided to come back into a female body as it started in the first place, it was so masculinized at the time that the body it was in was now a female body, and the body was attracted to another female because the soul, instead of it being feminine as it first appeared in the first body, it has now become masculinized. And so now it's attracted to a woman, a female body. So this is what is called lesbianism. This all went on for approximately 400 years. And since this was the law of that religion at the time, there was certainly an awful lot of babies born during that 400-year period. And so this is why we have all over the world today, we have men that are sitting in women's bodies, and we have women sitting in men's bodies. It all occurred during that time. This is why so many of the people have been persecuted over the years for simply being attracted to their own sex. For truly this proves, as the spirit voices have told me, that being gay, as we use that term today, is not a choice. It's not a choice, it's a natural thing, because the soul in that man's body who is attracted to another male is a female soul. And so the soul in a woman's body who is attracted to another woman, has become masculinized. And there was never a time that women crossed over. It was men, that men crossed over. It was women that did it in the first place, but that was a law of the land set up by the priest. That's all there was to it. This is not a place that people would come just to get drink and water. It was specially set up for this. You can see the features over there. This is the same place that I saw. They showed me in a vision many times, and the water was running red with blood because of the bleeding of these little girls. But over the many years, and they told me that this operated for 400 years, which certainly gave plenty of time to produce an awful lot of children, which eventually, through their thinking processes, they had such a strong desire to come back as a boy and not be treated this way, and eventually that happened, and that's why we have so many crossovers all over the world. And you notice that all those sculptured features over there are all little children, little girls, all of them. This was something that they thought had to be done, because this water here is not like water out in the lake in the open. It's coming from underground, which means it was hidden water. And I don't know who created that, but they figured that the blood in the human body is hidden, as well as this water is hidden. And so therefore they created this thing, and they called it a baptizing in blood and water. From what the voices told me many times, and now it's becoming more clear to me, they made these phalluses, and they would force the little child to sit down on it. And usually it was far too big. It was even too big for an adult to use. And if you look closely at these old figures, the little girl at the right corner is sitting on a phallus, as well as the one in the second one from the right corner. That was an observation platform for the mothers of those little girls. And they were there. It looks as if they're down on their knees, and they're facing that, and they're also praying, because these children are screaming because of the pain that they're going through. The last thing that happens is that the priest penetrates those little children with all that blood and everything else. Then the ceremony was over. Even with this child torn inside, a man could come along and take that child right out of its mother's arms and rape it. Yet the priest set up this law to make this happen. And they're saying here that see that stone right there with the two knobs, you might say, on it? Mm-hmm. That symbolized the breast of the female. Only for the pleasures of the men. Evidently, this was a specially prepared place to do this to these little girls, and because of the plaque that you're seeing now is straight out there on the viewing stand in front of where the little girls would be, as far as I'm concerned, tortured. A lot of care, a lot of work went into creating this whole place, because it seems as if it's some religious ritual simply because it has something to do with God.
Okay. Thank you. We're back. That's a very, very disturbing clip, to say the least. So let me just get this straight. Through Spirit's guidance, the two of you went to Turkey.
Yes.
And you found this site. And not only that, it sounds like you found a lot more. You found answers to why there is homosexuality.
Yes.
Well, what you saw there was exactly what they showed me in a vision. Exactly. Because we had been traveling all over that country, and we were getting to the point that we were almost giving up, and it was 2 days before, two days?
Yeah,
2 days before we were to leave.
And this was the last Hittite site we were going to.
Right.
I had seen pictures of this in a book, and I just knew we weren't going to find anything because I had seen pictures of it. Now, the pictures weren't too clear, and I was actually looking at the camera, because again, I have a lot more tape than we showed here on the clip. I was actually looking at the camera at the little girls, and Carl says, there it is, there it is. I said, there's what? I'm looking at it. I didn't even see it.
Nancy told me that later that day or that evening, you could hear me hollering a mile away when I first saw that. I mean, we were coming down the hill, and there it was right in front of us. You know, I mean, I just totally became beside myself when I saw this, because it was the same identical thing I'd seen in a vision over here in this country, and that's what, 7,000 miles from here?
Yeah, I would think so.
So anybody just going by there, a tourist, wouldn't know
They wouldn't
that
know.
that's what
They
that's
wouldn't know
about
what
at
it
all.
was.
But the way you have shown it and the way it was
Yeah.
explained to you
It's very
is
powerful.
horrifying.
Yes.
And just to think of the treatment of little girls, and this went on for hundreds and hundreds of years, but you know what? It makes sense. As horrifying as it is, it makes sense.
Right.
Why have we never heard anything about this before?
They don't want us to know it.
No. And the other thing is a lot of people have a hard time dealing with this whole concept because it does bring in reincarnation, and because the
Right.
church removed that from the Bible, they say that it's not part of Christianity. It was, Jesus taught about it, but they removed it from the Bible because the church felt that if people thought they could reincarnate and get it right the next time, they wouldn't have to follow the church's teachings in this life, and they didn't want that. So they took reincarnation out.
As a woman watching this video, I couldn't help but have some very strong feelings come up. And I know that I wasn't necessarily there, but just the thought of how they treated females, what they thought of females, unfortunately today still rings true with respect to the church and religious rituals. And it's a horrifying connection to make, that it was in that culture, and there are other cultures too that you've researched.
Yes.
Are we going to have time to show that picture of them?
Yes.
I want the public, I want the viewers to see this. This has happened. This only happened a few days ago.
What we're going to do, viewers, is we're going to share with you a clip on a modern-day baptism. And really the research in Turkey was what was called a blood and water sanctuary,
Yeah.
which was also a type of a baptism then.
That's right.
Yes.
And
Blood
because
and
we
water.
passed the anniversary of the Epiphany, there is something recently that came to our attention, and one of the local newspapers in Sydney has put together a clip that he would like to share with you.
The Russian Orthodox Church has tied together the baptism of Jesus and Epiphany.
This
And
made,
this is-
excuse me, this made my blood boiled. I couldn't even stand to watch it. You've got it?
Yes.
You got a clip for that?
Yes, can we have the second clip, please?
This is religion. This is in modern day Russia, right?
Yes.
Wait till you see this. And all the men involved in this, they're all laughing, they're smiling, and they're putting this child through the worst torture you could ever imagine. And how could they say this child came into the world with sin? Oh, God, this is a horrible picture.
If we could have that clip, please.
All religions were started after a psychic event. Abraham clairaudiently heard and obeyed the voice of spirit. Judaism grew from his experience. Mohammed also heard the voice of spirit, and Islam was founded based on his teachings. The Mormon religion was again founded when Joseph Smith heard and obeyed the voice of spirit. Many mediums who performed the gifts of the Spirit were thought of as miracle workers. Jesus, who was a medium, used natural law when he demonstrated the gifts of the Spirit. He levitated when he walked on water, created apports when he multiplied the food for the multitude, and even raised the dead through the gift of healing. Because most people do not see spirit and are ignorant of the gifts of the Spirit, they mistakenly believe that mediums have supernatural powers. As a result, many superstitious beliefs existed in biblical times, which have continued until today. In the Bible, we read of one of these superstitious myths. So it was, as they were burying a man, that suddenly they spied a band of raiders, and they put the man in the tomb of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. 2 Kings 13:12. This myth became the foundation for another myth created centuries later concerning the wife of Emperor Constantine, the ruler of the Roman Empire who legalized Christianity. Ernest Alfred Wallace Bunge writes in his book Amulets and Superstitions, according to this, she, Empress Helena, on May 3rd, 328, found 3 crosses but she did not know which of the three was the one on which our Lord has suffered. At length, either as a result of her own cogitations or acting under the advice of a devout priest who was with her, she had the body of a dead man brought and laid upon one of the crosses. As contact with that cross had no effect upon the dead man, she had him placed on a second cross, and that also produced no effect on the dead man. Then she had the body removed and placed on a third cross, and the dead man came to life immediately. Many people still believe this mythology that the cross became endowed with supernatural powers. Yet crosses are not a repository of psychic energy. Priests were supposed to have psychic gifts. The proof of this lies embedded in the Hebrew and Arabic languages. We find in the Encyclopedia of Religions and Ethics that the Hebrew word for priest is kohen, and the corresponding Arabic word kahin means a soothsayer. More exactly, as we learn from the Arabic lexicographers, one who has a familiar spirit to tell him things otherwise unknown. We are told that Moses' brother and sister, Miriam, and Aaron, the first priest, were psychically gifted with the gift of clairaudience. And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses, and they said, Hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken by us also? Numbers 12, verses 1 through 2. It wasn't long before the priesthood lost the gifts of the Spirit and only began imitating them. For centuries, priests have claimed to be in communication with God, which is spirit. However, they were neither clairvoyant nor clairaudient. They could not see visions or hear the voices of spirit, nor does psychic or healing energy flow from their hands. This is how they celebrate Epiphany in several Russian Orthodox churches. There is a religious processional from the church to the river. The head priest dips a cross into the water before making the sign of the cross 3 times to bless the water. The people believe that the cross sanctifies the river water into healing water, which can cure the sick. It is also believed that you will receive special blessings if you are dipped into the frigidly cold water. The New London Day newspaper printed this picture from the Associated Press, showing a young 4-year-old child being dipped into the 41-degree river water. The religious zeal and fervor is quite obvious on the faces of these men as they immerse this young child into the chilling waters. However, the child's face does not hide her utter discomfort, and the memory of this event will probably do more to traumatize her than to bring her any good fortune. Ironically, Epiphany, a Greek word meaning manifestation, commemorates the Magi's visit to the baby Jesus. The Magi's gifts were manifested or materialized through the psychic gift of apports.
Good idea. Thank you. So now we have seen a modern-day version recently of what we would call a baptism of sorts. Not too different from long ago, where little girls were also subject to different types of rituals or baptisms.
Yes.
Carl, did you want to share a comment or a thought about this
Modern
Epiphany?
torture.
Okay.
My words, modern torture.
I myself have read that all the waters on that day, the day of the Epiphany, heal people and make them well and take care of all types of problems. Isn't that true?
Well, if just by dipping a cross into the water makes it healing water, I don't think so. Healing occurs when healing energy it flows from the hands of a healer or a mediumistic healer. And yes, you could take a glass of water and you could hold it like this, and the energy could flow from my hands into this water and energize the water, and you can drink it. But just by dipping a crucifix in it, that's not going to happen. That's not going to turn it into healing water.
Okay. So, just to remind our viewers, we have a very little bit time left to the end of the show. But if any of you would like to share any stories or thoughts about baptisms or anything that's a ritual per se, that you've always wondered about that maybe didn't make any sense to you, we welcome your calls and your comments to our live number, 889-1728, for just a few more minutes now. So
that child will always be afraid of water. Always. Always be afraid of water. I'm afraid of fire. I was burned at the stake some lifetimes ago. I was also drowned some lifetimes ago.
So now we have looked at the cause or the origin of homosexuality
That was only
with respect to children being traumatized by exactly this
Yes.
type of thing and then worse.
Yes.
So what you're saying is, as a result of that experience in this little girl's lifetime, she's going to have some type of a mark,
We
I
ran out of
suppose.
time, but we brought some other things here we wanted to show the people. We're going to do that on another program. We want to show the public some of the things that Spirit wanted us to show.
Okay.
There's so much ignorance going on out there. This is why the world is in such a mess. God is within all people. God is not in some piece of real estate in the sky. That's ridiculous. That was all created by the ignorance of man. Just as those children, those little girls were treated so badly that man had to put God in the female, that only males, God was within the males. If it's a woman out there, she prays to God, pray to God. She'll listen to you. She'll answer your prayers.
As we've mentioned in previous shows, when we clarified what God is within all of us.
Absolutely. Right there, right behind the breastbone. You see, if we're born with two bodies, we're born with a physical body, we're born with a spiritual body, and when death comes to the physical body, it gives birth to the spirit body, and when you go on living, you don't go into no halfway house, purgatory. That's all man-made. I hate to even hear that word. No such thing. It's man-made. And if anybody's stupid enough to think that somebody's going to come along and die for them when it gets ready to die, got news for you. Nobody's going to do that for you. You're going to go down that lonesome road by yourself. And to think of these people that fly around in their own private jets in the name of Jesus, these televangelists, and all of this business. I've never asked anybody for money. I could have a cathedral today if I really wanted to. I'm here to do what He wants me to do. And last night He wanted me to put this sign up here today and talk about it. And there's people out there that keep the wires hot ever since we started this program. Oh, I hear it. I get all the feedback. He should know this by now, and there's a lot of other people. There's very little that goes by that I don't hear about. And the people wonder how I know about it. My God,
Well,
I tune in.
We need to wrap up tonight's show, unfortunately. And I know we can discuss this topic and probably continue in another show. And what I want to remind our viewers is that quite a bit of the research up until this show is found in this book, My First Encounter with an Angel, School of Ancient Wisdom, Revelations of Ancient Wisdom, excuse me.
Right.
And this is a book that both Reverend Hewitt and Sidney Schwartz have co-authored. And at the end of the show, you will see a place where there's information, an informational number that you can write to should you want to find this book or speak to Sidney or Carl personally. And with that, I have to say thank you very much for sharing with us this very mind-blowing research. And also thank you, viewers, for tuning in. Until next week.